The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the cruelest part. Tuesdays were the days Abigail Rowan did laundry, mended boots, and pretended that life in Red Hollow, Montana Territory was manageable. Not good. Not even fine. Just manageable. But on this particular Tuesday morning, Victor Ashcombe rode his imported black horse straight through her front gate, dismounted without invitation, and dropped a document onto her kitchen table like he was discarding something he'd already stepped on. "You have 30 days," he said, not looking at her. Looking instead at her walls, her ceiling, her children's drawings pinned near the window, calculating what everything was worth without her in it. "After that I collect." Abigail didn't pick up the paper. She already knew what it said. She'd been watching Victor do this to 3 other families that winter. She just hadn't believed she'd be next. If you've ever been told that what you've built with your own hands doesn't belong to you anymore, then you already know exactly how this story feels. Stay with us, because what happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about who deserves to survive. Before we go further, if this kind of story moves you, please subscribe to this channel and turn on your notifications so you never miss what comes next. And when this episode is over, drop a comment telling us the city and country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Let's begin. The winter of 1887 came early and stayed mean. By the second week of November, the passes above Red Hollow were already buried under 4 feet of snow, and the wind that came down off the mountains at night had a particular cruelty to it. Not just cold, but personal, the kind of cold that found the gaps in your walls and reminded you exactly how thin they were. Abigail Rowan had learned not to hate the cold. Hating it took energy she didn't have. She was 36 years old, though most people who hadn't known her before Thomas died would have guessed older. Not because she looked worn down, she didn't exactly, but because she moved through the world with the kind of careful economy that belongs to people who have already spent everything they had and learned to ration what was left. Every gesture was purposeful. Every word she spoke meant exactly what it said, no more, no less, because she'd stopped having the luxury of wasting either one. Thomas had been gone 4 years. 4 years was supposed to be long enough to stop reaching for a warm body on the other side of the bed in the dark. It wasn't. She'd stopped mentioning that to anyone, though, because the women in town who had never lost a husband looked at her with a particular kind of pity. She found worse than indifference, and the ones who had lost husbands nodded too hard, too fast, with eyes that told her the reaching never entirely stopped. You just got better at pretending you hadn't done it. She had 2 children, Clara, who was 9, and was the kind of quiet that made teachers nervous and strangers feel obscurely judged, and Henry, who was 6, and had his father's habit of tilting his head exactly 14 degrees to the left whenever he was trying to understand something, which meant Abigail spent a significant portion of her life trying not to cry while her son was simply thinking. They lived in a house on the eastern edge of town that was technically adequate, which was a word Abigail had made peace with. The roof held in most places. The stove worked if you persuaded it. The porch had a step that she'd been meaning to repair for going on 8 months. But every time she had an hour free, someone's child had a fever, or someone's wife was bleeding wrong, and the step stayed broken, and she stepped over it, and life continued. She was the closest thing Red Hollow had to a doctor. There was a man named Ellery Hobbs, who had a medical certificate from somewhere back east, and a genuine fondness for whiskey that had a way of making those 2 facts difficult to reconcile. When Hobbs was sober, which was unpredictably, and sometimes marvelously, he was decent enough. But the families on the eastern side of the valley, the ones who couldn't ride 3 hours into town on the chance that Hobbs might be having a clear morning, had learned over 5 years to send for Abigail Rowan instead. She had no certificate. She had her mother's notebooks, a mind that retained what it read, and hands that stayed steady when everything else was going wrong. That combination had saved enough lives that people had stopped asking about the certificate. What they paid her was whatever they could manage: a jar of preserved plums, half a side of salt pork, twice, memorably, a live chicken, which Clara had immediately named and which Abigail had not had the heart to explain the alternative purpose of. The chicken was named Gerald. Gerald was still alive. This was not financially ideal. On the morning that would change everything, not the Tuesday morning with Victor Ashcombe, but the morning before it, the morning where the ground shifted quietly beneath her before she understood what was moving. Abigail woke up before the children because she always woke up before the children, poked the stove to life, and opened the tin where she kept what was left of her money. She already knew what was in it. She'd been knowing what was in it for 3 days, in the way you keep hoping the number will change if you check enough times. It didn't change. There was enough for flour, not enough for flour, and the smoked meat Henry needed because he'd been thin since October in a way that worried her, a cough that didn't go away, ribs she could feel when she lifted him. She'd been stretching the food for 2 weeks, taking smaller portions herself, and hoping neither child was watching closely enough to notice. Clara was watching closely enough to notice. "Mama," Clara had said the previous evening, in that flat, careful voice of hers, "you didn't eat your portion." "I wasn't hungry." "You're always hungry." Abigail had looked at her 9-year-old daughter and felt something behind her sternum that had no clean name. Not shame. Not quite. Something more complicated than shame. The particular grief of a woman who is doing her absolute best and can see the exact distance between her best and what her children need. "I had a big lunch," she said. Clara looked at her for a moment that lasted considerably longer than a moment. Then she looked down at her plate and didn't say anything else. Children who have learned to stop arguing with their mothers are not children who believe their mothers. They are children who have learned that the truth doesn't always fix anything, and have made a quiet, devastating peace with that fact. Abigail was still thinking about that look the next morning, standing at the stove, when someone knocked at her door before 6 in the morning, which meant either a birth or an emergency, and she'd already learned to tell the difference by the rhythm of the knocking. This was a birth. She dressed in the dark, left a note for Clara, who would wake Henry, who would walk to school, who would pretend everything was fine in the particular way the Rowan children had become expert at, and spent the next 6 hours in a cabin 3 miles east of town, helping Marta Lenz bring a boy into the world who arrived sideways and decided at the last moment to turn the right way, which meant Abigail's hands did not shake, but her voice was quiet and steady for 6 hours in a row, in the way that left her feeling hollow afterward, the way wringing out a cloth leaves it dry. When it was over, Marta's husband pressed $2 into her hand with the expression of a man who knew it wasn't enough, and hoped she was too tired to say so. She was too tired to say so. She walked home in the late afternoon with $2 and flour and no meat, and the particular satisfaction of knowing a child was alive who hadn't been, and the particular grief of knowing she was going to have to explain to Henry again why supper was mostly bread. She was calculating whether she could make the $2 stretch until the Hendersons paid what they'd owed since September, when she turned the corner near the dry goods store and nearly walked into Silas Boone. She had seen Silas Boone before the way you see weather coming over a mountain. You know it's there, you note its approximate size, you go on with your business. He was not easy to miss. He stood 6'4" on a good day, with shoulders that suggested someone had built a man around a question about how wide shoulders were supposed to be, and then simply kept going. His hair was the color of wood smoke, dark with gray coming in at the temples, and he had a beard that was neither fashionable nor unfashionable because it had never consulted fashion about anything. He was 41 years old. He owned the Boone Ranch up in the higher valley, which was 1,200 acres of the best grazing land in the territory, and also 1,200 acres of the most isolated grazing land in the territory, which was either a blessing or a curse, depending on how you felt about solitude. He had a son named William, who was 8, and who had not smiled at anything anyone could recall since his mother had died 3 years prior of a fever that came fast and left faster. People in town said William Boone was strange. Abigail, who had spent more time around children in distress than most people would ever know, thought William Boone was an 8-year-old who was trying to carry a weight that would have staggered a grown man, and she didn't think there was anything strange about struggling under that. She'd never said that to Silas. She'd never said much of anything to Silas. They lived in the same small town and occupied different corners of it, and their lives had the kind of parallel quality that felt like it might continue indefinitely. Then he nearly knocked her down, turning the corner, caught her arm before she fell, and they stood there for a moment in the cold late afternoon light, with her $2 in her pocket, and Gerald the chicken presumably still alive at home, and absolutely no logical reason for her heart to be doing what it was doing. Mrs. Rowan. He let go of her arm immediately. Something careful in his eyes, careful in the way of a man who knows he's big and works not to use that against people. Mr. Boone. He looked at her, actually looked, not the half-second glance that most people gave her, the one that catalogued her quickly. Widow, healer, adequate, done, and moved on. "Are you all right?" he said. The question was so unremarkable that she couldn't explain later why it stopped her. She'd been asked if she was all right 100 times. She always said yes because that was the answer that let everyone continue their day. "I've been better," she said, and immediately wished she hadn't because that was not the answer, and something in his face shifted in a way she couldn't categorize. "Mrs. Rowan, I'm fine. Excuse me." She went around him and kept walking, and he didn't call after her, and she told herself the whole way home that this was not a moment of any significance whatsoever. She was almost entirely sure she was right. She got home to find Clara sitting at the table with a look on her face that Abigail recognized as the face of someone who had been sitting in exactly that position, waiting for exactly the right moment to say something difficult. "Mrs. Aldridge came by," Clara said. Abigail set down her things. What did she want? She wanted to leave something. Clara pointed at the table where a parcel sat wrapped in brown paper. She said not to be proud about it. Abigail opened it. Smoked meat. Enough for a week, maybe more. She stood there holding it and felt the back of her throat close in the particular way that happened when she'd been running too long on too little, and something kind arrived before she was braced for it. "Mama?" Henry appeared in the doorway from the back room, sock feet, tilting his head the 14 degrees. "Is that dinner?" "Yes," she said, and her voice was perfectly steady. "That's dinner." She cooked. Henry ate 2 portions and didn't cough once and fell asleep at the table before she could get him to bed, and she carried him, heavier than she'd expected, a good sign, he was heavier, and tucked him in with his coat over the blanket because the back room got cold at night. Clara was still up when she came back out. "Mama," Clara said, "are we going to be okay?" Abigail sat down across from her daughter, looked at her, this girl who was too old already, too careful, too aware of the gap between adequate and enough. "Yes," Abigail said. "Are you sure?" Abigail thought about the $2, about the broken porch step, about the way the second week of November had arrived with a cruelty that was going to get worse before it got better. She thought about walking into Silas Boone on a street corner and saying, "I've been better like a person who had temporarily forgotten how to lie correctly." "I'm working on it," she said. Clara considered this for a long moment. Then, with the gravity of a 9-year-old who had decided to accept an insufficient answer because it was at least an honest one, she nodded. "Okay," she said. "Good night, Mama." "Good night, baby." After Clara went to bed, Abigail sat alone at the table in the quiet house with the cold pressing in at the window glass, and she let herself feel, for exactly 5 minutes, the weight of everything she was carrying. Then she put it back, folded it up, and put it back behind her ribs where it lived. She had children to feed. She had people in this valley who needed her hands and her steadiness. She had a broken porch step that needed fixing, and a chicken named Gerald, who was, against all reasonable probability, still a member of this household. She could not afford to come apart. She had learned that a long time ago, and the lesson had not gotten easier, but she'd gotten better at carrying it. What she hadn't counted on, what she could not have anticipated, sitting alone at that table in the cold, was the knock that came the next morning. Not a birth knock, not an emergency knock. The knock that came at 7:10 on a Wednesday morning in late November was the measured, deliberate knock of a man who had decided something and arrived to say so. She opened the door to find Silas Boone standing on her broken porch step, hat in his hands, snow in his beard, with the expression of a man who had practiced what he was going to say and was already fairly sure it was going to come out wrong. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Mr. Boone," she said slowly, "it is 7 in the morning." "Yes," he said. "I know. Is something wrong?" He looked down at the broken step, back up at her. "Your step is broken. I'm aware. I could fix that." She stared at him. Outside, somewhere down the street, someone's dog was barking at the cold. "You rode down from the upper valley before 7 in the morning to tell me you could fix my porch step." He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "No," he said. "I rode down because I need to say something, and I should have said it yesterday when I saw you, and I—" He stopped, looked at the hat in his hands like it had somehow contributed to his difficulties. "Mrs. Rowan, I'm not good at this." "At what?" "Words." He met her eyes, and there was something in his face that was so stripped of pretense it was almost startling. No performance, no careful management of impression, just a man standing in the cold trying to say what he meant. "I watch you." Not, I don't mean that strangely. I mean, I see what you do in this town. I see what you carry, and I see you doing it alone, and I. He stopped again. I have a proposal, a practical one. I want you to hear it before you answer. Abigail's hand tightened on the doorframe. You have two children who need stability, he said. I have one child who needs a home that doesn't feel like a grave. I have a ranch with more room than I know what to do with and not enough people in it, and you have. He glanced at the broken step. Needs that aren't being met. That's not an insult. That's just, I see what's true. Mr. Boone, I'm not offering charity, he said, and something in his voice tightened like that word specifically was one he'd anticipated and had something to say about. I'm not asking you to be grateful. I'm saying that two broken things can sometimes hold each other up better than either one stands alone, and I think. He stopped. I think we might be two of those things. Abigail looked at him for a long time. The wind moved down the street and found the gaps in her coat. You don't know me, she said. I know enough. You know what this town says about me? Something moved in his face. I know what this town says about a lot of people. I've noticed it's not always the same as what's true. She didn't have an answer for that. She stood in her doorway in the cold November morning with her children asleep inside, and the broken step between them and Silas Boone standing in the snow with his hat in his hands, and she felt something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Not hope. Not yet. Something smaller and more dangerous than hope. The possibility of hope. I won't answer today, she said. I know. I might not answer the way you're hoping. I know that too. She looked at him one more time, then she stepped back from the door. The step is the third one from the bottom, she said. It needs a new board, not just a nail. He looked at her. A slow thing moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile, more like a man who had been holding very still and had just been given permission to breathe. I'll bring the wood, he said. She closed the door. She stood with her back against it in the quiet of her kitchen, her heart doing something completely unreasonable in her chest, while outside in the cold, Silas Boone stood on her broken porch step for another moment before walking back to his horse. Henry appeared in the doorway, sock feet, tilted head. Who was that? A man, Abigail said. What did he want? She looked at her son, thought about two broken things and how they sometimes hold each other up. I'm not sure yet, she said. Go get dressed. You'll be late. But for the first time in 4 years, 4 long, carefully managed, adequately survivable years, she stood in her kitchen and let herself wonder. Just wonder. Whether adequate was the only thing that was left for her, or whether something she hadn't dared to name was still, against all reasonable odds, possible. It was such a quiet thing, that wondering, and it scared her more than the cold ever had. He came back on Thursday with the wood. That was the thing that surprised her most. Not that he came back exactly, because she'd half expected that, but that he came back with precisely the right wood, cut to the right length, which meant he had measured the step somehow, either by eye or by memory, and neither possibility was entirely comfortable to sit with. Abigail watched him from the window for a moment before she went to the door. He'd tied his horse at the post and was already crouching by the porch, not waiting to be invited, not making a production of it, just a man with wood and tools doing a thing that needed doing. He had a boy with him. William. She recognized the boy from town, thin in the way that had nothing to do with food, with dark eyes that moved over everything and settled on nothing, like a child perpetually waiting for something to go wrong. She opened the door. Silas looked up. Morning. Morning. She looked at the boy. Hello, William. William looked at her with those dark eyes, said nothing. Then, after a pause that lasted just long enough to be noticeable, he said, Hello, in a voice that sounded like it hadn't been used in a while. He doesn't talk much, Silas said, in the way of a man who has stopped apologizing for a truth and is just stating it. That's all right, Abigail said. My daughter doesn't talk much either. She talks when she has something worth saying. Something shifted in William's face. Not a smile, but a slight, almost imperceptible relaxation, like a boy who had been braced for a different response. She went inside and brought out 2 cups of coffee, one for Silas and one for herself, and stood on the repaired half of the porch while he worked. They didn't talk much. That was the other surprise. How unawkward the quiet was. She'd spent 4 years filling silences because silence with other people had started to feel like an accusation, like proof of something missing. The quiet with Silas felt different. It felt like two people who didn't have anything to prove to each other yet, which was its own strange kind of relief. Henry appeared eventually, in his coat and his tilted head look, and regarded William with the frank assessment of a 6-year-old who has not yet learned to pretend he isn't staring. "How old are you?" Henry said. William looked at him. 8. I'm 6. I know. Henry considered this. Do you want to see Gerald? Who's Gerald? Our chicken. William looked at the chicken in its small enclosure at the side of the house, looked back at Henry. Why does your chicken have a name? Because Clara named him. What did he do wrong? Henry blinked. Then slowly the corners of his mouth went up. I don't know. I never thought about that. William didn't smile back. Not quite. But something in his shoulders dropped a half-inch, and the two boys walked toward the chicken together, and Abigail stood on the porch holding her coffee and watching, and didn't let herself think anything too large about it because large thoughts had a way of frightening things off. Silas finished the step, stood, pressed on it with his boot, nodded once. That'll hold, he said. Thank you. He looked at her. She looked at him. Between them the new board sat pale and clean against the older wood of the porch, obvious as a scar, obvious as a repair. My proposal still stands, he said quietly, so the boys wouldn't hear. No pressure. I just want you to know it's not something I said on impulse. I didn't think it was. Then you know I'll wait. She looked at him for a long moment. You're a patient man, Mr. Boone. When something's worth it, he said, and picked up his tools and called William and left. Abigail stood on her new porch step and watched them ride away and told herself very firmly that this was all very practical and reasonable and nothing to feel strange about, and nearly believed it. Clara came home from school at 3 and walked up to the porch and stopped on the new step and looked down at it. Mr. Boone fixed it, Abigail said before Clara could ask. Clara looked up. Why? He offered. Clara considered the step. Then Clara looked at her mother with those flat, careful eyes that saw too much. Do you like him? I barely know him. That's not what I asked. Abigail looked at her 9-year-old daughter and had the strong and recurring feeling that this child had arrived in the world 40 years old. Get inside and do your lessons, she said. Clara went inside without another word, but not before giving the new step one more look that seemed to reserve judgment. December came and brought the kind of cold that made December and November look like an apology. Silas came back the following week with firewood. Not a cord. Not enough to be charity, she noted, and suspected he'd calibrated this deliberately. Just enough to see her through 2 weeks. He stacked it without being asked, and William trailed behind him carrying the smaller pieces with the serious expression of a boy doing a man's job. And Henry insisted on helping, and the two of them together managed the pace of one child working alone, but neither boy seemed to mind. He didn't stay long. He didn't push. He didn't look at her the way men in town sometimes looked at her. That measuring look, the one that was half sympathy and half arithmetic, calculating what she was worth and whether the sum was sufficient. Silas Boone looked at her like he was paying attention. That was the only way she could put it, like he was listening even when she wasn't talking. She started to notice things. The way he stepped aside to let people pass on the street, automatically, without thought. The way he spoke to his son, not with the exaggerated cheerfulness of a man performing fatherhood for an audience, but with a plain directness, an assumption that the boy was worth being straight with. That fence won't hold, William. We need to redo the bottom rail before the snow gets heavier. Not softening it, but not unkind, just honest. She noticed that the people who dismissed him in conversation were usually people who had never needed him. The people who'd had livestock through a bad winter, or a fence come down in a storm, or a neighbor whose barn needed raising. Those people talked about Silas Boone differently. Quietly, but specifically, with the particular respect that comes from having actually watched someone show up. She was thinking about this in early December when Mabel Thurston cornered her at the dry goods store. Mabel was 63 and had strong opinions about most things, none of which she felt any obligation to keep to herself. She had been in Red Hollow for 30 years and considered this sufficient qualification to comment on everyone's business. I hear Silas Boone has been doing repairs at your house, Mabel said. not looking up from the bolt of fabric she was examining. He fixed a step, Abigail said, and brought wood. He brought wood. Mabel set down the fabric, looked at her directly. People are talking, Abigail. People in this town talk about whether it's going to snow. I don't see the use in managing my life around it. He could have any woman in 3 counties. Abigail turned to face her fully. Is there a question somewhere in that sentence, Mabel, or are you just letting me know? Mabel's eyes sharpened. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed, a short, dry sound. You haven't changed. I have, actually, considerably. What I mean to say, Mabel said, lowering her voice in a way that somehow made it carry further, is that people think he deserves better, younger, someone who hasn't already... She stopped. Already what? Abigail said very quietly. Mabel had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. Lived a hard life. I see. Abigail picked up what she'd come for. Well, when those people want someone to sit with them through a difficult birth in the middle of the night, or hold their hand when they're frightened and it's 3 a.m. and there's no one else, they know where to find me. And they also know I'll come, even after conversations like this one. She moved toward the door. Give my regards to your husband, Mabel. She walked out into the cold with her jaw set and her eyes dry, and the $2 she'd been about to spend still in her pocket because she'd forgotten to pay at the counter, and now she'd have to go back, and the whole clean exit was ruined. She stood outside in the cold and almost laughed. Almost. She went back inside, paid, left again, and this time the exit was unremarkable, which was fine. Clean exits were overrated. She'd learned that a long time ago. What she hadn't anticipated was that Mabel's words would stay with her, not because they wounded her, she'd had worse, but because they named a fear she'd been carrying without looking at directly. The fear that Silas was making a mistake, that she was too much of something, too old, too used, too complicated, too woven through with grief and years and a life that had already had its first chapter, and that he didn't see it yet, and when he did, the kindness would stop, and that stopping would be harder to recover from than if it had never started. She'd rather not begin than start and lose it. That was the truth she hadn't said out loud to anyone. She said it out loud to Silas 3 days later, because he had a way of appearing at moments when she had not yet finished constructing her defenses. He came by to check on a cough Henry had developed, not as a healer, but as a man who had heard about it from William, who had heard about it from Henry himself. He stood in her kitchen with his hat in his hands and asked after the boy with such uncomplicated, genuine concern that she said it before she'd made the decision to. People think you're making an error, she said, with this, with whatever this is. He looked at her calmly. What kind of error? The kind where you could do better. She held his gaze because she'd decided if she was going to say it, she was going to say it straight. Younger, less, don't, he said. The word was quiet, but it stopped her. Don't say whatever you were about to say, he said, because I've listened to a fair amount of nonsense from people in this town, and I'm not going to stand in your kitchen and listen to you say it to yourself. She blinked. I know what I'm doing, he said. I'm not a young man who's confused about what he wants. I'm 41 years old and my wife is 3 years dead, and I watched my son go quiet, and I'm standing here because I see something in this house and in you and in your children, and what I see... He stopped. Something worked in his jaw. What I see is real, not convenient, real, and I'd appreciate it if you'd let me be the judge of what's an error and what isn't. The kitchen was very quiet. Henry coughed from the back room. He needs willow bark tea, Abigail said, because she had to say something. I know. I brought some. He set a small cloth packet on the table. From the ridge. William helped me find it. She looked at the packet of willow bark on her kitchen table and felt the thing behind her sternum do something she couldn't quite contain. You're making this very difficult, she said. Good, he said, and there was something in it that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. I don't want to be easy to dismiss. He wasn't. The weeks continued. He did not press. He came when he had reason, and he left without lingering. He brought William, who began to speak slightly more around Henry, who had the social gift of asking questions without making them feel like interrogations. Clara remained reserved, watching Silas with her careful eyes, neither warming nor rejecting, simply observing, and Silas did not try to win her. That was the thing Abigail noticed most. With Henry, he was natural and straightforward. With Clara, he was patient and consistent and did not perform. He answered when she spoke to him and did not push when she didn't, and made no apparent effort to be liked. Clara noticed this too. One afternoon in mid-December, Abigail came in from the yard to find Clara and Silas at the kitchen table. Clara had her schoolwork spread out. Silas was sitting across from her reading something. She'd given him the Red Hollow Gazette that someone had left at her door, the November issue, and neither of them was talking. They were just occupying the same space in a silence that appeared, against all reasonable expectation, to be comfortable. Abigail stood in the doorway for a moment and didn't say anything. Clara looked up. "Mama, Mr. Boone says he has a bigger table." Abigail looked at Silas. Silas looked at the newspaper. "I mentioned the kitchen at the ranch is larger, that's all." "He said I could spread my maps out properly," Clara said, with the tone of a child who is relaying information and absolutely not advocating for anything. "You could," Silas said, still looking at the newspaper. "If you wanted." The kitchen was quiet. "We'll see," Abigail said. She went to start supper, and behind her she heard Clara go back to her schoolwork, and heard the specific quiet of two people who are not talking but are no longer strangers either, and kept her face very carefully neutral. It was the second week of January when everything shifted. Not in the way she'd feared. Not a rupture, not a revelation, not Silas appearing with a different face. What shifted was something external, something she had not seen coming, which made it worse. She was at the courthouse, as she sometimes was, checking the public land records. She had a habit of tracking which families were delinquent on their homestead filings, because sometimes they didn't know, and she could tell them before it became a problem. It was one of those practical habits she'd developed out of necessity and kept out of something that looked, if you squinted, like love for the people in this valley. She wasn't looking for anything specific. She found something specific. A land claim filed 6 weeks prior, under a company name she didn't recognize, Terrace Holdings, against a parcel in the Upper Valley. The parcel description was familiar in a way that took her a moment to place, because she'd never paid close attention to the exact boundaries of Silas's land. But as she read the filing a second time and then a third, the certainty settled in her stomach like cold water. This was Silas's land, not all of it. A strip along the eastern border, 70 acres, but 70 acres that included the lower grazing field and, more critically, the water access to the creek that fed the rest of the property. She sat at that courthouse table for a long time, reading the document very carefully. The claim was built on a survey record from 1879, 8 years prior, that described an alleged prior homestead claim predating Silas's title. The language was technical and dense, the kind of language that was designed to be impenetrable to anyone without legal training, and the filing was notarized by a county clerk in a different county entirely. She had seen fraudulent land claims before. She had a neighbor growing up whose family lost 40 acres to exactly this kind of maneuver. She knew what the architecture of it looked like. This was the architecture of it. She made careful copies of the key details in her notebook, put her notebook in her coat, and asked the clerk on duty, a young man named Perkins who was not crooked, just incurious, who had filed the document. "Agent of record is a man named Harlan Cross," Perkins said, "filed on behalf of Terrace Holdings." "And who owns Terrace Holdings?" Perkins blinked. "That's not... I wouldn't have that here." "No," she said. "Of course not." She walked out of the courthouse into the January cold and stood on the steps with her notebook in her pocket and thought about Silas's face when he talked about his ranch. The specific, unperforming way he talked about it. Not bragging, not performing attachment, just the matter-of-fact tone of a man describing the ground his life was built on. She thought about William, who had started in the last month to occasionally smile. She thought about Henry at the table saying, "Do you want to see Gerald?" She turned left instead of right and walked to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Amos Greer was 55, competent, and deeply uninterested in paperwork, which was a combination that had served Red Hollow adequately and would now be tested. She put her notebook on his desk and explained what she'd found. Greer read. His face changed in the slow, reluctant way of a man who would have preferred to eat his lunch in peace. "This could be legitimate," he said. "It could be," she agreed. "But the 1879 survey it references, I know the surveyor who worked this valley that year. His name was Aldous Fitch, and he died in 1881, which makes him convenient to reference and impossible to contradict." Greer looked at her over the notebook. I'd like to find out who owns Terrace Holdings, she said. That's not exactly a matter for the sheriff's office. Not yet, she said. But if this filing proceeds and Silas Boone loses water access to that creek, it won't be a civil matter for very much longer. Greer looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who was deciding how much work something was going to make for him. I'll make some inquiries, he said. I'd appreciate it. She left the sheriff's office and stood outside again in the cold, and knew, with the particular certainty of a woman who had been reading trouble long enough to recognize its handwriting, that what she'd found in that courthouse was not the beginning of this. It was the middle. Whatever this was had been building before she'd found it, and someone had expected no one to find it at all. She also knew something else, something that stopped her on the street and made her close her eyes briefly in the cold. She had to tell Silas. She had to tell a man who had been quietly patient and genuine and entirely without pretense for 6 weeks that someone was in the process of stealing what was his, and she had to do it without being sure yet how bad it was, which meant she was going to have to go to his house and sit across from him and watch his face change. She'd watched enough faces change with bad news that she knew exactly what it cost them. She knew it cost the messenger something, too. She mounted her horse, she had borrowed Mrs. Aldridge's mare for the day, and turned toward the Upper Valley Road. She was halfway there when she understood something she had been circling for weeks. She was going because she'd found something that concerned him. That was practical. That was reasonable. That was the kind of person she was. The kind who told people things they needed to know. But she was also going because the thought of Silas losing that ranch, losing the ground his son was slowly beginning to come back to life on, was something she could not sit still with. That wasn't practical. That was something else. She didn't give it a name. Not yet. Some things need time before they can bear the weight of being named. She rode up the mountain road into the late afternoon cold with her notebook in her pocket and the wind at her back. And whatever was happening in her chest, she set aside, because there was work to do, and she had never once in her adult life let what was happening in her chest get in the way of work that needed doing. But she noticed it. For the first time in a long time, she let herself notice it. The Boone Ranch appeared through the tree line as the light was going flat and blue, the way January light goes in the mountains before it gives up entirely. Smoke from the chimney. A light in the window. A boy's silhouette. William. Moving past the glass and then stopping, having seen her on the road. By the time she dismounted, Silas was already at the door. He took one look at her face. "Come inside," he said. She came inside. She sat at his table, a larger table. Clara had been right about that, large enough for maps. And she opened her notebook and she told him what she'd found. She watched his face while she talked. He didn't interrupt. He didn't move much. His hands, flat on the table, were very still. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet except for the fire, and distantly, William's voice talking to himself over some game in the next room. "Terrace Holdings," Silas said. "Yes." "I've never heard of them." "You wouldn't have. That's the point." He looked at the notebook. "The 1879 survey. Aldous Fitch died in 81. His records exist, but he can't speak to what they say or don't say." Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked up at her. "How did you find this?" he said. "I keep track of the land filings. Not specifically, just as a general. It's a habit." She stopped, looked at him. "I wasn't looking for this. I found it." He looked at her for a moment in the firelight, and his expression was doing something complicated and controlled. "Abigail," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her name, and neither of them acknowledged it, but it sat between them in the warm kitchen like a third thing in the room. "How much trouble is this?" She could have softened it. She was capable of softening it. "Enough," she said instead, because he'd told her he didn't like nonsense, and she'd decided she believed him. "But not more than can be answered if we move first." He held her gaze for a moment. "We," he said. She realized what she'd said, considered taking it back. Didn't. "Yes," she said. "If you'll let me help." Outside, the January wind moved through the tree line and the fire popped and William laughed at something in the next room, a brief bright sound, like something striking glass. Silas looked at the fire for a moment, then back at her. "I'll make coffee," he said. "Then we'll figure out what to do." It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was two people pulling their chairs a little closer to the same fire. It was, Abigail thought, enough to start with. The coffee was strong and the fire was low by the time they finished going through everything she'd written down, and the clock on Silas's mantel read 8:30, which meant Abigail had been at this table for nearly 3 hours without noticing the time move. That had not happened to her in a long while. William had fallen asleep in the chair by the fire sometime around 7, with his head at the specific impossible angle that only children can sustain without waking themselves. And at some point, Silas had gotten up without ceremony and draped a blanket over him and come back to the table, and they'd kept working. That small thing, the blanket, the matter-of-factness of it, the way Silas had not made a performance of the gesture, stayed with Abigail in the part of her mind that was not focused on the documents. What they had, laid out between them in her careful handwriting, was this: a land filing that referenced a survey that could not be verified by its author because its author was dead, filed by an agent named Harlan Cross on behalf of a company called Terrace Holdings, targeting the eastern border of the Boone Ranch in a way that was surgical rather than random. Not a land grab by someone casting wide. A specific target, specifically chosen. Someone knows this land, Abigail said. The water access is the thing. Take those 70 acres and you don't just take the grazing field. You control whether this ranch survives a dry summer. Whoever drew this boundary knew exactly what they were cutting. Silas had been quiet for most of the last hour. Not shut down. She could tell the difference between a man who had gone silent because he was overwhelmed and one who had gone silent because he was thinking. This was thinking. I bought this land in '83, he said. Clear title. I have the deed. I know, I checked before I rode up here. She'd gone back to the courthouse records after speaking with Greer, verified Silas's original title filing. Clean, properly recorded. Prior in date to everything Terrace Holdings was claiming by 4 years. Then the claim doesn't hold. It shouldn't, she said. But the way it's written, if it gets in front of the wrong judge, or if it proceeds far enough that it starts to look like a legitimate dispute, you could spend 2 years and everything you have fighting it in court while someone makes that look like weakness. And if you run short on money fighting it... She stopped. Silas finished it. Then the ranch is already in trouble without the land being taken. Yes. He looked at the table. That's the point, isn't it? Win or lose the claim, the fight itself does damage. That's what I think. He was quiet again. The fire popped. William shifted in the chair without waking. Who's behind Terrace Holdings? Silas said. It wasn't quite a question. I don't know yet. She tapped her notebook. But Harlan Cross is a man I can find. An agent of record has to be findable. That's the nature of the role. He signed the document, which means he exists in some official capacity somewhere. You're going to look for him. I'm going to look for who he works for, she said. Cross is a mechanism. I want the hand that wound him up. Silas looked at her across the table with an expression she was beginning to recognize. The particular quality of attention he brought to things that mattered to him, unhurried and complete. Abigail, he said, again with her name, which she was getting used to in a way she was trying not to examine too closely. This could get uncomfortable. For you, not just paperwork. I've been uncomfortable before. This is different from a difficult birth. I'm aware. She met his eyes. I'm also the person who found it, which means I'm already involved whether I go further or not. And I would rather be useful than frightened. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, in the way of a man who has decided to accept something he might have argued against in a different life. Then we do it together, he said. She rode home through the January dark with a lantern and Mrs. Aldridge's patient mare and her notebook in her coat, and if the night felt different than it had that morning, she chose not to analyze why. The next 2 weeks were the kind of busy that left no room for the other kind of thinking, which suited her perfectly. She began with what she could access directly, the public records. She had spent enough time in courthouses across the territory, following land disputes for neighbors, helping families understand their filings, that she knew which clerks were incurious, which were helpful, and which had the specific quality of memory that made them useful for tracking documents across county lines. In the Cutter County Records Office, 2 days' ride east, she found Harlan Cross's signature on 3 other filings from the previous 18 months. Different parcels, different property owners, same structural pattern, prior survey references, deceased surveyors, technical language designed to obscure, filed under different company names that shared no obvious connection. Except they'd all been notarized by the same county clerk, a man named Doyle, who was no longer the county clerk of Cutter County, having resigned abruptly in October for reasons the current clerk described as personal matters, with an expression that communicated clearly that he was not going to elaborate. She wrote all of this down. Then she found one of the previous property owners, a rancher named Sutton, whose land dispute had been quietly settled out of court 8 months prior. Sutton was a cautious man. It took her most of an afternoon to persuade him to tell her what the settlement had involved. "I signed away 12 acres," he said. "Eastern Strip. Same as what they were claiming, more or less. My lawyer told me fighting it would cost more than the land was worth." "And the company you settled with?" He looked at his boots. "Meridian Land Associates. Different name than Terrace Holdings." She wrote it down. "Mr. Sutton," she said carefully. "Did anyone ever mention a name to you, the person behind the company?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "There was a man," he said. "Came out to look at the parcel before the settlement. Didn't introduce himself by name, but my neighbor recognized him. Said he was Victor Ashcombe. I don't know if that's right." Abigail's pen stopped moving. She knew the name Victor Ashcombe the way everyone in the territory who paid attention knew it, peripherally, as a feature of the landscape, the way you know a mountain is there without having stood on it. He was a land speculator out of Helena, money from back east, known for large purchases and a talent for acquiring property at prices that tended to work out unfavorably for the sellers. He operated legally, as far as anyone could prove. He had a lawyer on retainer who was widely considered one of the best in the territory and personally enjoyed making court appearances last as long as possible. She had not, until this moment, had any reason to connect him to Silas. She rode back to Red Hollow with Ashcombe's name sitting in her notebook and in her chest like something that had not yet decided what shape it was going to take. She went to Silas before she went home. He was in the barn when she arrived, doing the particular kind of work that gets done in barns at the end of January when the animals need tending and the cold makes every task take twice as long. He came out when he heard the mare, took one look at her face and said, "You found something." "Victor Ashcombe," she said. Something happened in his expression. Not surprise, or not entirely. "I know that name." "Most people do." "He approached me 2 years ago, wanted to buy the eastern pasture. I said no." She stared at him. "You didn't mention that." "I didn't think it was connected." He looked at her steadily. "I thought it was a business approach I'd declined. Men like that get told no regularly. I didn't think he'd—" He stopped. "Build a fraudulent legal claim to take what you wouldn't sell him," she finished. "No," he said. "I didn't think that." She told him what she'd found. Sutton. The pattern across 3 counties. The clerk who had resigned. He listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, without performing his reaction, just taking in what she said and turning it over. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He's been doing this to multiple ranches," he said. "At least 3 that I've found records for, possibly more. If he's using different company names, the filings won't show up in a single search. Someone would have to look across county lines and know what pattern they were looking for." Which no one was doing. "Until now," she said. He looked at her in the flat January light, and something moved in his face that she didn't have a clean name for. Something between gratitude and something else that was quieter, and went deeper. "I need to go to Helena," she said. "The Territory Land Office keeps consolidated records that the county offices don't. If I can trace all the company names back to a single registrant, we have the architecture of the whole scheme, not just one piece of it. Helena is 4 days' ride. 3 if the roads are clear." He looked at her for a moment. "I'll come with you. You have a ranch to manage. I'll get Patterson to watch the livestock. He's done it before. And William? William can come." He said it in the flat way of a man who had already considered the objections and was not going to be redirected by them. "Or he stays with the Hendersons. They've offered before. Either way, I'm not sending you to Helena alone on this." She opened her mouth, closed it. She was going to say she'd managed alone for 4 years. She was going to say she didn't need accompanying. Both things were true. She also knew that having Silas Boone beside her when she walked into the Helena Territory Land Office would change how quickly doors opened, because the territory of Montana in the year of 1887 was not yet a place where a woman asking pointed questions about land fraud received rapid assistance, and she was practical enough to know it. William stays with the Hendersons, she said. We leave Thursday. He nodded. I'll tell Clara and Henry. She looked at him. Why are you telling my children? Because Clara will worry if you're gone 4 days and doesn't know why. And Henry will ask William where you went, and William won't know, and then Henry will worry differently. He said it simply, without any suggestion that this was remarkable knowledge to have. I figured if I explained it to them first, they'd feel better. Abigail stood in the January cold outside his barn and looked at this man who had quietly learned enough about her children to know which one worried which way, and felt the thing behind her sternum do something she could no longer pretend was just gratitude. All right, she said, finally. Thursday. They left on Thursday in a sky the color of pewter that couldn't decide whether to snow. The ride to Helena took them through country that Abigail knew well enough to respect, and not well enough to be comfortable in. Long stretches of ridge road where the wind came sideways and the horses had opinions about the footing, and valleys that were beautiful in a way that didn't care whether you noticed. She and Silas rode mostly in the practical quiet that had become their default, which was different from the loaded silences of people who don't know each other well enough to be quiet together. They talked, when they talked, about the case, about what she expected to find in Helena, about the pattern she'd identified and whether it would hold under the kind of scrutiny that official records invited. Once, stopped to rest the horses at midday, she told him about her mother's land notebooks, the habit she'd inherited of tracking property records, initially because her mother had a neighbor who'd been dispossessed and had decided that knowledge was a form of protection. Your mother taught you to read land records, he said. She taught me that people with power count on other people not knowing the rules, she said. She said ignorance was a luxury that worked out poorly for everyone except the people counting on it. He looked at the landscape for a moment. She sounds like someone worth knowing. She was. She looked at her hands on the reins. She died the year before Thomas. 2 losses in 18 months is... She stopped. It changes your arithmetic, what you think you can afford to risk. He didn't fill the silence with anything. He let it sit, which was the right thing to do with a sentence like that, and she appreciated it more than a response would have given her. The proposal, she said, after a while, not looking at him, looking at the road. Yes. I haven't answered it. I know. I want to. She kept her eyes on the road. I want to be clear about that. It's not that I don't want to answer it. Then what is it? She thought about how to say it honestly. I'm afraid of what happens if I say yes and then I lose it. I've lost a lot. I've gotten fairly good at surviving it. She paused. I don't know if I'd survive losing this. Silas was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was even. I'm not going anywhere, Abigail. You don't know that. Nobody knows that. Thomas didn't know it either. He let that sit for a moment. But I think you know the difference between a man who's asking because it's convenient and one who's asking because... He stopped. Something worked in his jaw. Because he hasn't thought about much else for 3 months. The wind moved through the ridge grass. That's a considerable thing to say, she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. I'm a fairly considerable person, he said, in several senses. She looked at him, startled, and found something in his face that was, improbably, a very slight smile. She laughed. It came out sudden and real, the kind of laugh that surprises you by arriving, and she felt something in her chest loosen that had been pulled tight for a long time. Was that a joke? She said. I have them occasionally, he said. Don't read too much into it. She was still smiling when they rode into the next valley, and she let herself be. The Helena Land Office was a stone building on a corner 2 blocks from the territorial capital, staffed by a senior clerk named Beaumont, who had the particular brand of bureaucratic suspicion that comes from decades of watching people try to do things in official buildings that official buildings are not designed for. He looked at Abigail the way she'd expected. Then he looked at Silas, who was approximately as large as the doorframe and had the quiet expression of a man who had all day and did not particularly care who knew it. Beaumont pulled the records. She spent 4 hours in that office. What she found in those 4 hours was the entire shape of it, and the shape was worse than she'd expected, and also, once you could see it whole, exactly as bad as it logically had to be. Terrace Holdings. Meridian Land Associates, Summit Ridge Properties. 3 other names she hadn't encountered yet, all registered within the past 3 years. All filing land claims in the same structural pattern, all tracing back through layers of paper that were clearly designed to obscure the line, but not designed by someone who expected anyone to actually follow it, to a single registered agent. Harlan Cross. And Harlan Cross, according to a business registration filed in the territorial capital in 1885, operated as the legal agent of record for a Helena-based land investment firm called Ashcombe and Territorial Holdings. Victor Ashcombe. She had it. All of it. 6 ranches across 3 counties, 3 of which had already been settled, meaning Ashcombe had already successfully extracted land from families who hadn't known what hit them, and 3 still in process, including Silas. She copied every document reference with the specific, unhurried handwriting of a woman who understood that what she was holding was not just evidence but protection. For Silas, for the other ranchers, for whoever came after. When she stood up from the table, her hand ached from 3 hours of writing and her back was tight from the chair, and she didn't care about either. Beaumont looked at her stack of notes. "You finding what you need?" "Yes," she said. "I need certified copies of 6 specific filings. I'll pay the copy fee." He looked at her for a moment with a different expression than the one he'd started with. "This about the Ashcombe scheme?" She stilled. "You know about it?" "I've noticed the pattern," he said. "Been noticing it for about 8 months." His voice was careful. "I don't have authority to do anything about what's filed here. I'm a clerk. I record what's brought to me." "But you've been watching." "I've been watching," he said. "And I'm glad someone else is watching now." He paused. "The copies will be ready in an hour. No charge." She walked out of the inner office to where Silas was waiting in the outer room, sitting in a chair that was too small for him with his hat on his knee, and he stood when he saw her face. "I have it," she said. He looked at her. "All of it?" "All of it. 6 ranches, the whole structure. It goes directly to Ashcombe." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do we do with it?" "Greer first," she said. "He's local and he'll want the credit for the arrest, which means he'll move faster than if we go above him. Then we get this to the federal land office." She held his gaze. "This is bigger than one sheriff, Silas. What Ashcombe has been doing crosses county lines. That makes it federal territory." He nodded slowly. Something was working in his face. Not relief, not yet, but something like the first sight of an exit in a room you've been trapped in. "The other ranchers," he said, "the ones who already settled." "I know." She'd been thinking about that on and off for the last 4 hours. 3 families who had already signed away land they should have kept. There are remedies for fraud. They're slow and they're expensive, but they exist. She looked at him. "We get Ashcombe first, then we help them." "We," he said again. "Yes," she said. "We." He looked at her for a long moment in the anteroom of the Helena land office, winter light coming through the one small window, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything more than that. They didn't need to. They rode back to Red Hollow with the certified copies in her saddlebag and arrived on the 2nd day of February in a dry cold that felt, for the first time in weeks, like something manageable. She went to Greer the morning after they returned before she'd fully recovered from the ride, because the documents needed to be in official hands faster than her back needed rest. Greer looked at what she put on his desk for a long time. He looked up. "This is Ashcombe." "Yes." "Victor Ashcombe." "Yes." He sat back in his chair with the expression of a man contemplating the significant gap between what he'd expected his Tuesday to involve and what it had apparently decided to become. "He has a very good lawyer." "I know," she said. "That's why the documentation needs to be complete. I've given you the full chain, registrations, cross-references, the connection between all 6 company names and the original agent. It's not one bad filing. It's a coordinated pattern across 3 counties over 3 years. That's not a civil dispute. That's criminal fraud." Greer looked at the stack again. "I need to contact the federal marshal's office," he said slowly. "Yes, you do." He looked at her. "This is solid work, Mrs. Rowan." "It's careful work," she said. "There's a difference. Solid implies it came easily." He almost smiled. "I'll send a wire today." She stood. "The other ranches, Sutton and the others who already settled. Their cases should be part of this. I'll include it. She walked out of the sheriff's office into the February cold and stood on the steps for a moment. The same steps she'd stood on 6 weeks ago when she'd first brought Greer a few lines in a notebook and a suspicion. It was considerably more than suspicion now. She became aware, in the days that followed, that something had changed in the quality of attention Red Hollow paid to her. It was subtle. A look held a half-second longer here, a greeting that carried something more than politeness there. She didn't know exactly what was traveling through the town's information channels, but something was, the way weather travels. She also became aware, more uncomfortably, that someone was aware she'd been to Helena. She noticed it first as a feeling, the particular unease of being watched, which was different from being looked at, and took her a few days to trust as real rather than imagined. Then she noticed a man she didn't recognize sitting outside the dry goods store for the second time in a week, in weather that didn't invite sitting outside, who found things to look at that were not her a half-second too late. She mentioned it to Silas. He didn't dismiss it. He also didn't tell her she was overreacting, which she appreciated more than she would have told him. "How long?" he said. "Since we got back from Helena. Maybe before." He was quiet for a moment. "Ashcombe has people in this territory, not just Cross." "I know." "He may already know we've been to the land office." "I know that too." She looked at him steadily. "It doesn't change what we do next." He looked at her for a long moment, then, "No," he said, "it doesn't." But something had shifted in the quality of his watchfulness, and she felt it, and she understood that this was no longer just about paperwork. They had moved into territory where paperwork alone was not going to define the danger. She went home that evening to find Clara at the table with her map spread wide and Henry asleep already, and she sat down across from her daughter in the lamplight and felt the particular weight of knowing that what she was doing, what she had chosen to do, had consequences that existed in the same house as these two children. She almost said something about it, almost pulled back. Then she thought about Sutton's face when he'd said, "I signed away 12 acres." She thought about the 3 other families who hadn't known the rules and had paid for it. She thought about what this valley would look like in 5 years if Victor Ashcombe continued to do what he was doing, one ranch at a time, taking land from people who didn't know how to fight him. She thought about William, sleeping easier these last few weeks, about Henry's cough that had cleared, about a large table that was big enough for Clara's maps. She did not pull back. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and began writing everything she knew about Harlan Cross that she hadn't yet put on paper, because there was always more to find, and she had always been better at forward than at standing still. Outside, the February dark settled over Red Hollow, and somewhere across town, in the sheriff's office, a wire was making its way toward the federal marshal's office in Helena. And in a fine house in Helena itself, a man named Victor Ashcombe was sitting at a desk considerably more comfortable than hers, reading a report that had just been delivered to him, and the report was about her. She didn't know that yet. She would. The report that reached Victor Ashcombe's desk on the 4th of February was 3 pages long and written in the careful, impersonal hand of a man who had been paid to observe without being observed. It described Abigail Rowan, her trips to the courthouse, her visit to Cutter County, the 4 days in Helena, the certified copies she'd walked out of the land office carrying, the wire Greer had sent to the federal marshal's office, which Ashcombe had a separate source for, a clerk in the telegraph office who supplemented his salary in ways the territorial government would not have approved of. Ashcombe read it twice, set it down, poured himself a glass of whiskey he didn't drink, and stood at the window of his Helena office looking at the street below with the expression of a man recalculating. He was 54 years old, heavy in the shoulders, with the particular confidence of someone who had spent 3 decades learning that most problems had a price and most people had a number. He was not, by his own estimation, a cruel man. He was a practical one. The land he acquired through his shell companies would be resold at a profit to Eastern investors who wanted a piece of the territory's future without the inconvenience of living in it. The families displaced were, in his accounting, simply people who had been sitting on value they didn't know how to extract. He was providing a service. He had told himself this so many times that he had achieved something close to genuine belief in it. What he had not accounted for was a 36-year-old widow with her mother's habit of reading land records and an apparently inexhaustible willingness to ride across counties in January. He set down the undrunk whiskey. Cross, he said to the man sitting in the chair across the room. Harlan Cross was 40, lean, with the kind of face that blended into backgrounds, and the kind of mind that was useful precisely because of it. He handled the legal architecture. He was good at his work. He was less good, Ashcombe was reflecting, at anticipating that someone might examine the architecture from the outside. She has everything, Ashcombe said. It wasn't a question. The land office copies are certified, Cross said. If she gets those to a federal marshal. Greer already wired Helena. I know. Ashcombe turned from the window. How long before a marshal comes out? 2 weeks. Maybe 3. The weather? 2 weeks. Ashcombe was quiet for a moment. That's workable. If the documentation doesn't reach the marshal intact. Cross looked at him. I'm not asking you to do anything, Ashcombe said, with the careful precision of a man who understood which words, if repeated later, would cause him difficulty. I'm noting that documents can be lost. People can be persuaded to reconsider what they know. These are observations, not instructions. Cross said nothing. He'd worked with Ashcombe long enough to know the difference between what was said and what was meant, and he'd also worked with him long enough to know that when Ashcombe started making observations of that nature, what happened next was going to be the kind of thing that kept lawyers employed for years. He had 2 men in Red Hollow already, the kind of men who were useful for certain categories of problem. He sent them a message the following morning. Abigail noticed the change in the man outside the dry goods store on the 7th of February. He'd been a fixture, or something attempting to be a fixture, for 10 days, and she'd cataloged him the way she cataloged everything that worried her, quietly, without giving any visible indication that she'd noticed. But on the 7th he was gone, replaced by no one, and the absence felt worse than the presence had. She went to Silas that afternoon. He was already saddling a horse when she arrived, and he looked up at her with an expression that told her he'd been about to come to her. The watcher's gone, she said. I know. One of my hands saw 2 men ride out toward the upper road this morning, men he didn't recognize. He pulled the cinch tight. I don't like it. No. She looked at the horse, then at him. Where are you going? I was going to come get you. Something in his jaw. I want you to stay at the ranch. You and the children. She looked at him steadily. Silas, hear me out. He turned to face her fully. The certified copies, where are they? In my house, in the floorboard under the stove. No one who didn't know would find them in a year. And the originals are in Helena. Beaumont has them, yes. Then they can't actually stop this by going after the documents here, he said. Even if they found yours, the land office has everything. The wire is already sent. He looked at her. So if someone's going to do something now, it's not about the documents. The sentence settled between them. It's about persuading witnesses not to testify, she said, or persuading investigators not to investigate. She held his gaze. The February cold sat around them in the barn, and she was aware, with the particular clarity that comes when you understand a situation has changed its nature, that they were no longer in the territory of paperwork and county clerks. You think they'd actually... I think Victor Ashcombe has a great deal to lose, Silas said, and I think men with a great deal to lose sometimes make decisions they wouldn't otherwise make. He looked at her. I'm not trying to frighten you. You're not, she said, which was mostly true. I'm trying to be honest with you. I know. She looked at the horse, at the barn door and the flat February light beyond it. The children can stay at the ranch. I can send them with Mrs. Aldridge today. She's offered before she won't ask questions. And you? She looked at him. I'm not staying at the ranch while there are still things to be done, Silas. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who had expected this answer and was not happy about it, and was also not going to waste time arguing with it. Then we don't go anywhere alone, he said. Either of us. Until the marshal gets here. Agreed. Henry and Clara went to Mrs. Aldridge's that evening, and Abigail explained to them with the specific economy of a woman who had learned to communicate urgency without communicating panic that she needed them somewhere safe while she finished some work. Henry accepted this with his tilted head and his 6-year-old faith that his mother's explanations were sufficient. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Is it about the land? Clara said. Abigail looked at her daughter. Yes. Mr. Boone's land. Yes. Clara was quiet for a moment. Are you going to fix it? I'm working on it. Another long pause. Are you going to be safe? This was the question Abigail had been waiting for and had no clean answer to. I'm going to be careful, she said. That's what I can promise. Clara studied her. Then she picked up her bag and went without further argument, which was, in its way, Clara's form of trust. And it cost Abigail something to walk away from. She stayed at the Boone Ranch that night, in the spare room off the kitchen, and lay in the unfamiliar dark listening to the sounds of a different house. The way the wind came off the mountain differently here, the particular creak of the roof beams, the distant sound of the livestock, and told herself that what she felt was not fear so much as the heightened awareness that preceded important things. She was almost asleep when she heard Silas in the kitchen, not moving around, just the sound of a man sitting in a chair and not sleeping, which was its own kind of sound if you knew what to listen for. She lay still for a moment. Then she got up and put on her coat and went out. He was at the table with a cup of something that had long gone cold. He looked up when she came in and didn't look surprised and didn't say anything immediately, which was one of the things about him that she had stopped being startled by and had started to simply accept. She sat down across from him. You're not sleeping either, she said. I keep thinking about the road, he said. The upper road, where my hand saw those men this morning. It's the logical route if they're watching the ranch. Yes. He looked at his cold cup. I have to ride up there tomorrow. One of the fence lines in the north pasture came down in the last snow. I had Patterson check it, but it needs proper repair. If I leave it, I lose half my stock by spring. She looked at him. Then we ride up together. Abigail, we agreed, she said, neither of us alone. That includes fence lines. He looked at her for a moment with the complicated expression of a man who understood that being protected and being capable of protecting himself were not mutually exclusive categories, and was still working out how to hold both. All right, he said. They sat in the quiet kitchen for a while, not talking much, and she was struck, not for the first time, by how comfortable the not talking was, how it felt less like absence and more like a different kind of presence. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. When your wife died. She stopped, started again. How did you keep going? With William? With the ranch? How did you? She shook her head. I know how I kept going. I had to. There was no alternative. But you had a ranch to run alone and a child who'd gone silent, and I want to know. She looked at him. Was there a day when you thought you couldn't? He was quiet for long enough that she thought she'd asked wrong. Every day for the first year, he said. Not the big dramatic kind of can't, just the small daily kind. Getting up in the morning kind. He turned the cup in his hands. William stopped talking for about 6 weeks after she died. Not completely. He'd say yes or no. He'd say if he was hungry. But nothing beyond function. I didn't know if it would come back. How did it come back? I don't know exactly. I just kept showing up, kept talking to him even when he didn't answer, kept doing the next thing. He looked at her. I wasn't heroic about it. I was just present. I'm not sure there's another way. She thought about that. About 4 years of just being present, of doing the next thing. You're the first person who said that to me, she said. What? That they weren't heroic about it. Everyone else tells me I'm so strong, so capable, like what I've been doing is admirable. She looked at the table. Most of the time I'm just doing the next thing, that's all. And it doesn't feel like strength. It just feels like the only option available. Maybe that's what strength actually is, he said, the unheroic kind. She looked at him in the lamplight and felt, very distinctly, something shift behind her sternum. Not the flicker she'd been managing for weeks. Something larger. Something she was going to have to deal with soon. Not tonight, she thought. Tonight there were fence lines and strangers on roads and federal marshals who hadn't arrived yet. She went back to bed and slept better than she had in a week, which she didn't examine too closely. The next morning they rode north before the light was fully up. It was Silas who saw them first. He said her name. Just her name, quiet and flat. And she heard the change in it and looked where he was looking. 2 men on the ridge road above them, sitting their horses in a way that was not the way of men passing through. They were too still. Positioned at the top of a natural bottleneck in the road, where the trees came close on both sides, and the footing changed from packed snow to uncertain ice. Abigail's hand tightened on her reins. Keep riding, Silas said. Normal pace. Don't look at them directly. They're above us. I know. They'll have to come down if they want to do anything. That takes time. His voice was even. I want you to turn back at the next fork. Silas, I mean it. He glanced at her. You're not disposable. The case is not disposable. You turn back at the fork and you ride to Greer's office and you don't stop. She looked at the men on the ridge, looked at him. What about you? I know this road, he said. I know every inch of this ranch. I'll be fine. You don't know that, Abigail. His voice was steady, but there was something under it. Not fear exactly, but the awareness of someone who had done the calculation and understood the variables. Please. She had never heard him say please before. Not like that. Not in that particular way, that particular weight on the word, that told her it was costing him something. She looked at the men on the ridge one more time. If you're not at Greer's office by noon, she said, I'm coming back with the sheriff. Noon, he said. Yes. She turned at the fork. She made it 40 yards before she heard the hoofbeats on the ridge road begin to move. She didn't look back. She rode. She was at Greer's office in 22 minutes, which was faster than the road should have allowed, and she dismounted with her heart loud in her chest and pushed through the door and found Greer at his desk and told him in 3 sentences what she'd seen on the ridge road and approximately where. Greer was on his horse in 4 minutes. He brought 2 deputies she'd never seen before, which meant he'd been expecting something like this, which meant he'd been taking this more seriously than he'd let her see, and she made a note of that. She waited. The waiting was the worst thing she had ever done, and she had done genuinely terrible things, had held people's hands while they died, had delivered stillborn children, had told men their wives were gone and there was nothing more to be done. She knew bad waiting. This was different in kind. This was the waiting that had a specific face on it. He walked in at 11:47. He had a cut along his left cheekbone that was going to bruise into something significant by tomorrow, and his coat was torn at the shoulder, and he moved with the slight careful gait of someone whose ribs had recently had opinions expressed about them. But he walked in under his own power, and he looked at her from across the room, and his face did the thing that she had run out of ways to pretend she didn't affect. She crossed the room and stopped in front of him and looked at the cut on his cheekbone and said, Sit down. I'm fine. You're bleeding. Sit down. He sat down. She cleaned the cut with what Greer had in his office, which was not much, and she did it with her hands steady because her hands were always steady when there was work to do, and she was aware of his face very close to hers and the particular quality of his stillness while she worked. What happened? She said. 2 men. They came down off the ridge after you turned at the fork. He held still while she worked. They had a specific message, which was that the woman who had been asking questions should stop asking questions, or the questions would get answered in ways neither of us would appreciate. Her hands stopped for half a second, started again. They said that, more or less, in rougher language. And the cut? I expressed some disagreement with their position, he said. One of them was enthusiastic in his counter-argument. She looked at him. And the other one? Something moved in his face. He's the one who'll be sore tomorrow. Greer appeared in the doorway. The men on the ridge road are in custody. They weren't hard to find. They weren't expecting the sheriff to move that fast. He looked at Silas's cheek. You all right? Fine. They say anything? Enough, Silas said. They were hired. I don't think they'll protect whoever hired them for very long. Greer nodded slowly. This is going to accelerate things. I'll send another wire to Helena tonight. This isn't a land dispute anymore. This is intimidation of witnesses and assault. He looked at Abigail. You did right coming in fast. She nodded. She was looking at Silas. He was looking at her. You should have those ribs looked at, she said. I know a healer. You do, she said. She's standing in front of you, and she's telling you to sit still. He sat still. She checked his ribs in Greer's back room with the sheriff standing in the outer office and the February wind against the windows, and 2 of the ribs were bruised but not broken, which was the best news she'd had all week. She told him to breathe carefully for 2 weeks and not lift anything that weighed more than a fence post. He looked at her when she said it with an expression that communicated clearly that he was going to do exactly whatever the ranch required, regardless of what the fence post guideline suggested. I mean it, she said. I know you do. Silas. Abigail. He held her gaze. They were trying to scare you. I know. Did it work? She looked at him, thought about the 40 yards of road where she'd heard hoofbeats behind her and kept riding forward. Thought about the last 6 weeks of courthouse records and county clerks and certified copies, and a man named Beaumont who had said, I'm glad someone else is watching now. Thought about Sutton's face and the 3 families who'd already lost land and hadn't known what to call the thing that took it. No, she said. It made me angry. Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile. Something more serious than a smile. Good, he said. Stay angry. The federal marshal arrived 11 days later. His name was Tanner, he was out of Helena, and he was the kind of man whose competence showed itself by how little he said and how carefully he listened. He sat across from Abigail in Greer's office for 2 hours, going through her documentation, asking precise questions, and saying very little that wasn't a question. At the end of the 2 hours, he closed his notebook. The 2 men in custody have named Harlan Cross as their point of contact, he said. Cross is in Helena. We'll have him by Friday. He paused. Ashcombe is more complicated. He's got lawyers who are already preparing arguments about the separation between his legitimate business interests and the activities of Terrace Holdings. The registration documents I found connect him directly, Abigail said. I know. His lawyers will argue he had no knowledge of how Cross was using his agency. Tanner looked at her. They'll try to make Cross the end of it. Cross isn't the end of it, she said. He's a mechanism. I agree with you, but proving it in a territorial court with Ashcombe's legal representation is not a simple proposition. He tapped the certified copies. This is strong. The pattern across 6 ranches is strong, but strong isn't always enough if the other side has better lawyers. The room was quiet. Abigail thought about the patterns she'd found, about the shell companies that all traced back, about the one thing she'd found in Helena that she hadn't yet told anyone because she'd been waiting to understand its significance. The Doyle connection, she said. Tanner looked at her. The clerk who resigned from Cutter County. He notarized 7 of the filings before he resigned. All 7 were under different company names, but they all went through his desk. And I found a property registration from 1884. She opened her notebook to the page she'd marked. A house in Cutter County, registered to a man named Edwin Doyle, which would be unremarkable except that the property was purchased for considerably more than its assessed value, and the seller of record was Meridian Land Associates. Tanner was very still. Ashcombe paid the clerk, she said. Not in cash. In property. Harder to trace, but not impossible if you know to look for it. She turned the notebook to face him. I copied the registration details. The valuation discrepancy is documented in the county assessor's records. Tanner looked at what she'd written. For the first time in the 2 hours they'd been sitting together, something changed in his face. A slight controlled shift that on a less composed man would have been satisfaction. Mrs. Rowan, he said, how long did it take you to find this? About 6 weeks, she said. Give or take. He looked at her for a moment. Do you have any legal training? No, I have my mother's notebooks and a good memory. He closed his own notebook. I'd like you to provide a formal witness statement. Everything you found, the sequence you found it in, the methodology. He paused. Ashcombe's lawyers will try to discredit the documentation. The best way to prevent that is to have the person who gathered it testify to exactly how she gathered it. I'll testify, she said. You understand that Ashcombe will know you're the primary witness. He already knows who I am, she said. His men made that clear on the Ridge Road. Tanner looked at her steadily. That's true. He stood. Good. I'll need you available for the next several weeks. There will be additional questions. I'll be available. He left, and she sat alone in Greer's office for a moment with her notebook in her hands, and she felt the particular tiredness that comes not from having done too much, but from the sudden absence of urgency, the way a muscle feels when you finally set down something heavy. Silas was waiting outside. He'd been waiting outside because Tanner had asked to speak with her alone, and he'd accepted that without argument, standing in the February cold with his hands in his coat pockets and his breath visible. She came out and stood beside him and looked at the street. Tanner thinks we have enough, she said. For Cross, definitely. For Ashcombe. She paused. He's going to fight. Of course he is. It might take months, a trial, testimony. Silas looked at her. I know. This isn't over. No. He was quiet for a moment. But it's different from where it was 2 weeks ago. She looked at the street, at Red Hollow in its February state, gray and cold and ordinary. A woman came out of the dry goods store across the road and nodded to her, and she nodded back, and the ordinary exchange felt strangely significant, the kind of ordinary that only registers when you've been afraid for a while. I want to ask you something, Silas said. She looked at him. Not about the case. He met her eyes. The proposal. She was quiet. I know the timing isn't. He stopped, started again. I know there's still a fight ahead. I know you're going to be needed as a witness, and that's going to take time. I'm not asking you to make a decision that changes your life in the middle of a situation that's still unresolved. He looked at her steadily. But I need to know if there's still something to wait for. Because I'll wait as long as it takes, but I need to know it's not. He stopped. Not what? She said quietly. Not just patience with no destination, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had fixed her porch step and brought willow bark tea and sat at her kitchen table in the dark, and not filled the silence with anything unnecessary. This man whose son had started to smile again, who had ribs that were going to be purple by tomorrow, and hadn't mentioned them once since she'd checked them, who had said please on a mountain road and meant it all the way down. It's not that, she said. He held her gaze. Then what is it? She thought about what she'd said in the barn, on the road to Helena, about being afraid to lose another thing she'd started to need, about the arithmetic of loss and how it changes what you think you can afford. I'm still afraid, she said. I want to be honest with you about that. I know. But I'm less afraid than I was. She held his gaze. And I'm more afraid of the alternative. Something happened in his face, that controlled, careful face that she had learned to read over 3 months, learned where the feeling lived under the surface. Something shifted and settled, and she saw it, plain as weather. The alternative, he said. Not doing this, she said. Not finding out what this is. He was quiet for a moment. The February wind moved down the street and found neither of them quite willing to look away from the other. That's enough for me, he said. For now. For now is all I have, she said. For now is more than nothing, he said. For now is how most things worth having actually start. She looked at him one more time. Then she looked at the street, at the town that needed her, at the work still ahead. She felt, underneath the tiredness and the fear and the still unresolved weight of everything Ashcomb's arrest would require, something she hadn't felt in 4 years of adequate and manageable in doing the next thing. She felt, quietly and without drama, like she was standing at the beginning of something rather than the middle of something she was only holding together. It wasn't certainty. It wasn't rescue. It was just the specific, irreplaceable feeling of a door that wasn't closed. She'd forgotten what that felt like. It turned out she hadn't forgotten as completely as she'd thought. Harlan Cross was arrested on a Friday, which was, in Abigail's experience, the kind of detail that stuck in memory for no logical reason. Not a dramatic Friday. A plain one, gray and cold, the kind of day that doesn't announce itself as significant until afterward, when you look back and mark it. Marshal Tanner sent word through Greer. Cross had been taken into custody at his Helena office without resistance, which said something about Cross. That he was the kind of man who understood when a position had become untenable and had the self-preserving intelligence not to make it worse. His lawyers were already talking. That was the word Tanner used. Talking. Which meant Cross was calculating what his cooperation was worth and whether it was worth more than his loyalty to Ashcombe. And that calculation, in Tanner's experience, tended to resolve quickly in favor of cooperation. Abigail read Tanner's message standing in Greer's office and felt not the relief she'd expected, but something more complicated. The recognition that one piece had moved and the board had shifted, but the most important piece was still in play. Ashcombe had not been arrested. Not yet. Tanner's follow-up note, which arrived 2 days after the first, was careful in the way of a man who had learned not to make promises about timelines. Cross was cooperating. The testimony he was providing was consistent with Abigail's documentation and filled gaps she hadn't been able to fill from records alone. Specifically, the direct communications between Cross and Ashcombe regarding which properties to target and why. Ashcombe had been methodical about it. He'd had Cross identify ranches with water access, clear title, and owners who lacked either legal knowledge or the resources to mount a prolonged defense. He'd been building a portfolio of the territory's best grazing land, one fraudulent claim at a time, and he'd been doing it for 3 years, and he'd been very nearly done. Nearly. Abigail gave her formal witness statement to Tanner on a Tuesday in Greer's office. 3 hours of careful, sequential accounting of every document she'd found, every county she'd visited, every record reference and cross-check and irregularity she'd identified, and why. Tanner asked precise questions. She gave precise answers. When it was over, he looked at his notes for a moment and then looked at her. "You missed nothing," he said. It wasn't flattery. It was an observation delivered with the same tone he used for everything else. "I missed the Doyle connection for 2 weeks," she said. "I was focused on the company names and kept assuming the notarization was procedural. It wasn't until Mrs. Rowan," he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite patience but was adjacent to it. "I've worked with trained investigators who build less complete cases than what you put in my hands." She didn't know what to do with that. She thanked him and left. Outside, the March air had lost some of its bite. Not warm, not yet, but the specific quality of cold that suggests warmth is being considered somewhere in the future. She stood on the steps and looked at the street and thought about the 3 families who had already lost land. Sutton and the other 2. That had been sitting in the back of her mind through all of it, the part of this that documents and arrests couldn't fully address. She'd written to all 3 of them. Careful letters explaining what she'd found, what it meant, that there were legal remedies for fraud even after settlement, that the evidence now existed to support their claims. She'd told them about a lawyer in Helena, a woman she'd heard about through Beaumont at the land office, one of the first female attorneys practicing in the territory, a woman named Hartley, who had a reputation for taking cases other lawyers considered inconvenient. 2 of the 3 had written back. Sutton's letter had come first, and it was short, and in handwriting that looked like a man writing carefully because he wanted to get the words right. "I didn't know there was anyone paying attention," he'd written. "I thought we were just unlucky. My wife is the one who keeps telling me it wasn't our fault. Maybe now I can believe her." Abigail had read that letter 3 times. She'd kept it. Victor Ashcombe was arrested on the 14th of March. She heard about it the same way she heard about most things in Red Hollow, from Mrs. Aldridge, who had it from the telegraph operator, who had it from Tanner's office directly. 2 federal marshals had gone to Ashcombe's Helena house that morning with a warrant signed by a territorial judge. He had not gone quietly, according to the telegraph operator, who had clearly enjoyed relaying this detail. He had demanded his lawyer, who had been sent for and had arrived, and had, by all accounts, spent the first 20 minutes trying to argue with the arrest warrant on technical grounds, and the next 20 minutes being ignored. Cross's testimony, combined with Abigail's documentation and the Doyle property records, had been enough. Fraud across 3 counties, conspiracy, bribery of a public official, intimidation of witnesses. The 2 men from the Ridge Road had added their own statements once they understood that protecting Ashcombe had stopped being a profitable arrangement. The case was not over. There would be a trial, Tanner had made that clear. Ashcombe's lawyers were expensive and determined and would use every procedural tool available to them. But the man was in custody, his assets were frozen, his shell companies were exposed, and the architecture of what he'd built was being dismantled piece by piece in the offices of the territorial government. Abigail received the news on a Wednesday morning, standing at her kitchen stove with a cup of coffee she'd made too strong, as she sometimes did when she was tired. She stood there for a long moment after Mrs. Aldridge left. The kitchen was quiet. Gerald the chicken made a sound from outside that expressed, as usual, no particular opinion about anything. She sat down at the table. She had not cried through any of this. Not once, not even in the moments when it had been frightening. The men on the Ridge Road, the cut on Silas's face, the night she'd lain in unfamiliar darkness running through everything that could go wrong. She'd been too busy for crying, or perhaps more accurately, she'd been too focused, and the 2 things functioned similarly in her experience. She cried now. Not much, not dramatically, just the specific and private release of someone who has been holding something tight for a long time and has just been told they can put it down. After a few minutes, she wiped her face with her sleeve. She was alone. There was no one to observe the inelegance of it, and finished her coffee and went to tell Silas. He was where he usually was in the mornings, which she had by now learned to predict with reasonable accuracy. the north barn, doing the endless maintenance that a working ranch in March required. She found him with a bridle that needed new stitching, and he looked up when she came in. He read her face the way he'd gotten good at reading her face. "It happened," he said. "This morning. 2 marshals. He's in custody in Helena." He set down the bridle. He was quiet for a moment in the way she recognized. Not absence, thinking. "The trial," he said, "will happen. Tanner says 6 to 8 months before it reaches court. We'll both be called to testify." She looked at him. "His lawyers will make it difficult." "I know." He looked at the bridle in his hands, then back at her. "But the land filing is voided. The moment the fraud charge was confirmed, Greer has the documentation. Your eastern border is clean." She paused. "The water access is yours." Something moved through him. Not a visible thing, not something he performed, more like a tightening, releasing. The way a man breathes when he's been breathing carefully for a long time and just remembered he doesn't have to anymore. "Okay," he said, "just that." "Okay." She had learned to understand that for Silas, okay covered a great deal of ground. She helped him with the bridle, sitting on the bench in the barn while he worked, and they talked about what came next. The testimony, the timeline, the letters she was drafting for Sutton and the others. They talked about William, who had a loose tooth he was treating as a significant event. They talked about Henry's cough, which had not returned since December, and about Clara's maps, which had expanded to cover approximately half the surface of the larger table at the ranch, in a territorial survey she was conducting for reasons she had not fully explained to anyone. At some point the conversation shifted without either of them marking the shift. "I've been thinking about the medical room," Abigail said. He looked at her. "What medical room?" "I've been thinking—" She stopped. Started again more carefully. "When I was in Helena, when we were going through the land records, I kept thinking about what I do, what I actually do, and about how much of it I do in people's homes, or in my kitchen, or in barn lofts in the middle of the night, because there's nowhere else." She looked at her hands. "I've been thinking that if there were a proper space, not a full hospital, nothing like that, just a room with the right table and proper light and somewhere to keep instruments clean, I could do more. I could do it better." He was quiet. "I know it's a complicated thing to bring up," she said, "given everything else that's still unresolved." "Why is it complicated to bring up?" She looked at him. "Because of your proposal. Because where the room would be depends on—" She stopped. "I'm not using it as a condition. That's not what this is." "I know that," he said. "I just—" She looked at the barn wall. "I've spent 4 years doing everything in pieces. Healing in people's homes. Raising children in a house that's too small. Surviving in pieces. And I think—" She turned back to him. "I think I'm tired of pieces." He looked at her for a long moment. "There's a room off the east side of the house," he said. "It was meant to be a second parlor. It's never been used for anything. Good light from the south window. Wood floors, easy to clean." He paused. "We could put in a proper shelf for your supplies. The table would need to be custom. I can build it." She stared at him. "You've thought about this?" "I've been thinking about it since January," he said. "Since you told me about your mother's notebooks. I figured if you ever—" He stopped. "I wanted to be ready." She looked at him in the dusty light of the north barn, with the bridle half mended in his hands, and the morning coming through the cracks in the boards. And she thought about a man who had spent 3 months quietly preparing a room he wasn't sure she'd ever agree to use, and she felt something that had no adequate name move through her chest and settle. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, what?" "The proposal." She held his gaze. "Yes." The barn was very quiet. He set the bridle down on the bench with the deliberate care of a man making sure he didn't drop it, which was, she would think later, a very Silas way to receive the most significant answer of the past several months. He turned to face her fully. "You're sure," he said. "I've been sure for longer than I've been saying it," she said. "I was afraid." "I know. I'm still a little afraid. I know that too." She looked at him. "Don't make it easy. Don't tell me there's nothing to be afraid of, because there is. There's plenty to be afraid of. I'd rather you just—" She stopped. "Stay," he said. "Yes," she said. "That. Just stay." He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, which did not take very long given his dimensions, and he put his hands on either side of her face with a gentleness that was almost startling in a man that size. And he looked at her for a moment, the way he'd been looking at her since November, that complete, unhurried attention. And then he kissed her. And it was not a perfect kiss because she was not expecting the exact timing, and he had to adjust, and it was brief and warm, and nothing like what stories described. And it was entirely, specifically, real, and that was better than any of the other options. She laughed when it was over. Again, that surprised laugh that came out before she could manage it. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. I'd forgotten what it felt like, to want something and get it." He looked at her with that thing in his face that wasn't a smile but lived right next to one. "Get used to it," he said. "I'm working on it," she said. They told the children that evening. William first, because he lived at the ranch and because he was the one whose world was changing most directly. Silas sat across from his son at the kitchen table after supper and told him plainly, the way he told William everything. Without performance, without simplification, with the respect of a man talking to a person who deserved to know what was true. William listened. He looked at the table. Then he looked at his father. "Does this mean Henry and Clara will live here?" he said. "Yes." William was quiet for a moment. He picked up his fork and set it down. "Henry says Gerald can come too." Silas looked at Abigail. Abigail pressed her lips together. "Gerald is the chicken." "I know who Gerald is," Silas said. "He's a pet. He's not—" "Gerald can come," William said, with the flat certainty of an 8-year-old who has identified the thing that matters most in a situation and addressed it. Silas looked at his son for a moment. Something moved in his face. The particular expression of a father watching his child come back from somewhere far away, not all at once but piece by piece, and recognizing another piece returning. "Gerald can come," he agreed. William nodded and picked up his fork again and finished his supper, and that was that. Henry, told the following afternoon, tilted his head the 14 degrees and said, "So we'll live on the ranch?" And when Abigail said yes, he said, "William has a better sled," with the straightforward satisfaction of a boy whose priorities were entirely clear to him. Then, after a pause, he said, "Is Mr. Boone going to be our father now?" And Abigail said, "If you'd like him to be." And Henry tilted his head the other direction and said, "I think I would." And that was also that. Clara was last, and Clara was not that. Abigail told her alone, in the kitchen of their house in Red Hollow, the house with the new porch step and the adequate walls, the house that had been home for 4 years of survival. She told her straight, the way Clara had always required. No softening, no management, just the truth in clear sentences. Clara listened with her hands flat on the table and her face in the careful expression she used when she was processing something significant. When Abigail finished, Clara was quiet for a long time. "Are you happy?" Clara said. Abigail looked at her daughter. This child who had been 9 years old for about 40 years. "Yes," she said, "not the easy kind of happy, the kind you have to choose." "What's the difference?" "Easy happy just arrives. You don't do anything for it, and it's there." She thought about how to say the other part. "The kind you choose is, you look at something and you know it's going to be hard, and you know you could decide not to, and you choose it anyway, because what you'd lose by not choosing it is worse than the risk." Clara looked at her for a long moment. "Did you choose it?" "Yes." "Because of us, or because of you?" The question stopped her. Because it was, in its 9-year-old way, exactly the right question. The one Abigail had been asking herself since November, without quite framing it so cleanly. "Both," she said. "Is that allowed?" Clara thought about this seriously. "I think that's actually the right answer," she said, with the gravity of someone issuing a verdict. "If it was only for us, you'd eventually resent it. If it was only for you, we wouldn't feel secure." Abigail stared at her daughter. "Where did you learn that?" she said. Clara looked at the table. "I've been watching you for 9 years," she said. "I pay attention." Abigail reached across the table and took her daughter's hand, and Clara let her, which was not always something Clara permitted, and they sat like that in the kitchen of the house that had been adequate for 4 years. And Abigail felt something close in a way that wasn't sad, more like the feeling of a book reaching its last page, which is different from loss. "The big table," Clara said after a while. "At the ranch." "Yes. I can spread the full territory map. You can. Clara nodded slowly. Okay, she said. That's good. They married in April. Not a large wedding. Not a small one either, as it turned out, because Red Hollow had opinions about things that happened in it. And when those opinions were favorable, they expressed themselves in the form of people showing up with food and an expectation of being included. Mabel Thurston came, which surprised Abigail until she remembered that Mabel's opinions about what Silas deserved and her actual wish for Abigail's happiness were not necessarily the same thing, and the second one had apparently won. The ceremony was brief. A justice of the peace, the words that needed saying, the answers that needed giving. Silas's voice was steady when he said his. Abigail's was mostly steady. Not entirely. That seemed right. Some things should cost a little to say out loud. Afterward, standing in the yard of the Boone Ranch that was now also her ranch, watching Henry and William engage in a cooperative project with Gerald that seemed to involve some kind of course for the chicken to run, watching Clara standing at the fence line with her new map and a look of concentrated purpose, Abigail felt not the arriving without effort kind of happy she'd described to Clara. The other kind. The chosen kind. The kind that knew what it had cost to get here and held that knowledge as part of its value rather than in spite of it. Silas came and stood beside her. Your ribs, she said, are fine. They were bruised 3 weeks ago. They are fine now, he said patiently. She looked at him sideways. I'm going to be a difficult person to be married to. I know. I mean it. I have opinions about things, specific, strong opinions, and I'm not going to stop working. The medical room is already framed, he said. Patterson helped me with the walls last week. We need the windows installed, and then it's yours. She turned to look at him. You've already started. I told you in January I wanted to be ready. She looked at this man who measured porch steps by eye and brought willow bark in the cold, and sat in chairs too small for him waiting for federal marshals to finish asking her questions, who had said please on a mountain road and meant it all the way down, who had framed a medical room without being asked because he'd decided in January to be ready. I don't know how to do this, she said, not the being married part, the trusting that it stays part. Neither do I, he said, not anymore. He looked at the yard, at the children, at the particular late April afternoon that was finally warm enough to mean it. I think you just keep showing up, same as everything else. The Ashcombe trial began in September. Abigail testified for 2 days. Ashcombe's lawyers were exactly as skilled as advertised, and they did exactly what Tanner had warned they would. They questioned her methodology, her credentials, her relationship to the primary defendant in the land case, her right to have accessed certain records. She answered every question in the same tone she used for everything that mattered, even, precise, and complete. She did not get rattled. She did not get provoked. She had spent 1.5 years of her adult life telling frightened people things they didn't want to hear and keeping her voice steady while she did it. And whatever Ashcombe's lead attorney had expected from a frontier healer with no legal training, it had not been this. At one point, the attorney suggested that her investigation had been motivated by personal interest rather than civic concern, given her relationship with Silas Boone. She looked at him calmly. My relationship with Mr. Boone began after I found the fraudulent filing, she said. In that order. Not the other. But you were already acquainted. We lived in the same town of 400 people. We were acquainted the way everyone is acquainted. And your investigation? My investigation began because I found a pattern that looked like fraud, and I thought the people being defrauded should know about it, she said. Mr. Boone was one of those people. He was not the only one. I'd refer you to the Sutton case, the Brennan case, and the— Thank you, Mrs. Boone, the attorney said quickly. She let that sit for a moment. Rowan Boone, she said. I kept my name. This was not strictly relevant to the proceedings, but she'd decided in July that she was keeping it because her name was her mother's name and her mother's mother's name, and because the notebooks she'd been given were written in that name. And Silas had said, with characteristic economy, of course. And that had been the end of the conversation. Victor Ashcombe was convicted on 6 counts of fraud, 2 counts of conspiracy, 1 count of bribery of a public official, and 2 counts of intimidation of witnesses, the latter contributed to in no small part by the testimony of the 2 men from the Ridge Road, who had negotiated reduced sentences in exchange for their cooperation and had cooperated thoroughly. He was sentenced to 12 years. His assets, to the extent they could be traced, were ordered toward restitution. Sutton's case, and the cases of the other families who had settled under false pretenses, were subsequently reviewed by the territorial court. The road to recovery was neither fast nor simple. Abigail had told them it wouldn't be, but it existed, and it moved. The day after the verdict, Tanner came to Red Hollow to close out his formal involvement with the case. He sat across from Abigail in Greer's office one last time and shook her hand in the careful way of a man who doesn't shake hands often, but means it when he does. "I want to say something," he said. "All right. What you did, gathering that evidence, going to Helena, tracing the shell companies, that was not a thing most people would have done." He paused. Most people, finding that initial filing, would have told themselves it was someone else's problem or that they didn't understand it well enough to act. You didn't. "I understood it," she said. "Once you understand something, it's difficult to pretend you don't." He looked at her for a moment. "That's a rarer quality than you might think." She went home, to the ranch, which was home now, had been home since April, and found Silas in the north barn doing the eternal work of the north barn, and she told him it was over, and he looked at her for a moment with that complete attention, and then he put down what he was holding and crossed to her and held her in the dusty light of the barn without saying anything, and she let him, and that was enough. More than enough. Winter came again. Not the cruel early winter of the year before. This one arrived at the proper time, in the proper order, with the first snow landing on the last day of November, and the second following a week later in the measured way of a season that intended to proceed correctly. The medical room was finished by October. Custom table, 4 shelves on the south wall, a window that let in afternoon light at the angle Abigail had specified, a second door that opened directly to the yard so that people coming for care didn't have to walk through the family's kitchen. Silas had built the table himself. It was not a beautiful table in the decorative sense. It was the most functional table she had ever worked at, the height exactly right, the surface exactly what she'd needed, built by a man who had asked the right questions and listened to the answers. She had cried when she saw it. Not the private crying of March, but the other kind, the kind that doesn't particularly care who sees it. Silas had pretended not to notice, which was its own form of kindness. By December, she had seen 34 patients in the room. 11 of them had never come to her before, had previously been using the ride into town to see Hobbs on the uncertain chance he was having a clear morning. 3 families from the High Valley had started coming, including one family who had never in 6 years sought medical help from anyone, for reasons that included cost and distance, and the general suspicion of strangers that long winters in isolated places tend to cultivate. She was not saving everyone. She had never been saving everyone. But she was saving more, and she was doing it without apology, in a room that had been built specifically for the purpose, on a ranch that was hers as much as it was anyone's. Some nights, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, she sat at the large kitchen table, Clara's table, the one with enough room for the full territory map. And she did her records, and she could hear Silas in the next room, the specific sounds of a man ending his day, boots off, the chair by the window, the quiet that had become the texture of her life in a way she kept expecting to stop being surprised by, and kept not being. One such evening in December, a Sunday, she was writing up her records from the week when Clara appeared in the doorway in her nightclothes with an expression that was something other than her usual careful composure. "I can't sleep," Clara said. "Come sit down." Clara sat across from her, pulled her knees up to her chest in the chair, said nothing for a moment. "Mama," she said. "Yes." "Are you the same person you were a year ago?" Abigail looked at her daughter. Thought about November in a small house with a broken step and $2 and a tin she kept checking because the number wouldn't change. Thought about a man with a hat in his hand standing in the snow saying, "I'm not good at words." "No," she said. "Is that scary?" "Sometimes." She looked at her hands on the record book. "But not in the way I thought it would be. I thought changing would feel like losing something, like there'd be a version of me missing." She paused. "It doesn't feel like that. It feels more like there was a door I decided was closed, and it turned out it was just stuck." Clara thought about this seriously. Did someone unstick it? Abigail considered the question honestly, the way Clara always required. "No," she said. "I think I did. Silas held the frame, but I'm the one who pushed." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded with the particular nod of a 10-year-old who has received an answer worth keeping. I'm going to do that, Clara said, when I'm older, not wait for someone to unstick the door. Good, Abigail said. That's exactly right. Clara went back to bed. Abigail sat at the table for a while longer and listened to the December wind come off the mountain and find the walls of the ranch house and fail to get in. Because the walls here were not adequate. They were solid. They had been built by a man who built things to last. And she listened to the house hold against the wind and felt, in the particular bone-deep way of someone who has survived a great deal of cold, what it is to be warm. Henry's cough did not come back that winter. William's loose tooth fell out in October, and he accepted the gap in his smile with the philosophical equanimity of a boy who had stopped waiting for things to go wrong and had begun, quietly and in his own time, to expect that they might also go right. Gerald the chicken lived a long and apparently fulfilling life and was replaced, eventually, by Gerald II, whose naming was Henry's idea and which Clara accepted with resigned tolerance. The three families that Ashcombe had dispossessed were not fully restored to what they'd lost. That was the truth, and Abigail held it without trying to make it cleaner than it was. Two of them recovered enough to continue. One did not, and moved east, and she carried that one with the others she'd lost over the years, the ones she hadn't been able to save, the ones that were part of the permanent record of what trying looks like when the outcome isn't certain. Trying never guarantees the outcome. She had always known that. What you control is not what happens, but what you do with what you understand. In the spring of the following year, a woman in the High Valley came to the medical room with a situation Abigail had handled twice before, a fever in an infant that was going the wrong direction, and a mother who was frightened in that flat beyond words way that Abigail recognized from the inside. She sat with them for 4 hours. The fever broke at the end of the 3rd hour. The infant slept. The mother put her face in her hands and did not quite cry, and then looked up and said, "I didn't know anyone out here," and stopped. "I'm here," Abigail said. Simple as that. On the walk back from the medical room to the house that evening, crossing the yard in the late spring dark, she saw Silas at the fence line talking to one of his hands, pointing at something in the north pasture that needed attention. And he saw her crossing the yard and raised a hand in the simple acknowledgement of two people who have become part of each other's ordinary, and she raised a hand back and kept walking. That was the thing no one told you about the life you chose versus the life that happened to you. The one you chose didn't feel extraordinary. It felt like a Tuesday. It felt like supper on time and a child with a loose tooth and a chicken with an improbable name and a man who built tables at the right height without being asked. It felt most of the time simply like being present in your own life rather than surviving the edges of it. She had been surviving the edges for 4 years. She did not miss it. What she had now was not a story she would have written for herself, back in the time when she thought she was past the age of stories. It was stranger than that and more specific, built from pieces no one would have designed together on purpose. A land fraud, and a porch step, and a chicken, and a set of her dead mother's notebooks, and a man who was not good at words but was present in the way that made words largely unnecessary. She had been the woman everyone needed and no one chose. She had learned, at 36, in the frozen frontier of Red Hollow, Montana Territory, that those two things were not permanent conditions. That need and choice could exist in the same life. That a door stuck shut was not the same as a door sealed. That the unheroic kind of strength, the daily, unspectacular, do the next thing kind, was the kind that actually built something worth keeping. She went inside. The house was warm. Clara was at the table with her maps. Henry was arguing with William about something that involved considerable pointing. The stove was working without being persuaded. Silas came in behind her, stomping snow from his boots, and looked at the room the way he sometimes looked at it. That particular look, quiet and complete, of a man taking stock of something he had not taken for granted since the day he first understood he might actually have it. He caught her watching him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "You're smiling." "I'm aware." He looked at her for a moment, and the thing that lived next to his smile came as close to the surface as it ever did. "Good," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is."